Hello there and welcome back to another review. So keeping with that whole idea of like cult movies, movies I remember, movies from my childhood, movies I grew up with, today we're going to be talking about a film that I remember my friend when I must have been about maybe 6-7 years old, he recommended that I see. He's like, you got to see this movie, it's about these monsters that are sort of under your bed. And I rented this movie from the video store all the time, and the movie in question is 1989's Little Monsters, starring Fred Savage, Howie Mandel, Daniel Stern, and directed by Richard Allen Greenberg. Now, this is when kids' films were not afraid to be dark, right? They were not afraid to like push the boundaries of what kids would find scary, right? This film is dark, and if you remember sort of my Return to Oz review, they're very much the same in showing a darker, like in many ways more sophisticated and like sort of respectful movie for kids. And this is very much in the same vein as that. The film also has a bit of drama in places here too. And no question about it, as I'm sure this movie has gone to achieve cult following. And for those of you who do remember this movie and have seen it, I'd very much like to hear from you. So leave a note in the comments below if you are a fan of Little Monsters, if you remember this movie, if it's a film that you remember watching when you were little. Lots to be said about this movie. As I say, it's a real favourite of mine, a film I remember really well, and I just absolutely loved it. And watching it again recently, maybe it hasn't held up as well as maybe I would have liked it to, but there's still a lot of fun to be had with this movie, and it's still, like I say, it's very much deserving of a cult movie. I think it's even been called like a gateway movie for kids into sort of like the horror genre. It's like a horror movie done light, so to speak, if there is such a thing. But it was one of them movies from the video store when I rented it. It wasn't always guaranteed it was going to be in or not. Such was how popular and sort of this movie was at the time. And it's quite interesting that Fred Savage and Daniel Stern both worked on The Wonder Years, and here they are working together as well in this movie. Also have Ben Savage in this movie too. Always remember being, from Boy Meets World back in the day. Now, the film has quite a few it has Beetlejuice vibes running through it, and I might mention Beetlejuice sort of throughout the review, because it does have Beetlejuice type vibes and sort of tones to the movie. If you can imagine, it's sort of Beetlejuice done for kids, if that could be a thing. And that's, like I say, Beetlejuice vibes is no bad thing at all. And we all know what a classic movie that was. But I think Alan Monroe worked on this movie with sort of the pre-production designs of the monsters, and Howie Mandel's like Maurice character, even the character of Maurice, you can't help but think of Beetlejuice and the way he's sort of played and he's handled. And I thought he's over the top, he's funny, he's in your face, he's overkills it, just like Michael Keaton did in that famous movie. Alan Monroe, the guy, who I just mentioned, I think he had something to do with the designs on this, and he also, I believe, worked on Beetlejuice. I could be wrong, but yeah, the whole Maurice character, he's very much like a Michael Keaton. Like I say, he's over the top, he's in your face, he's unapologetic, he's all these kind of things. Sometimes, with this film, it sometimes runs a bit too close to being a bit like sort of a Beetlejuice ripoff, but because of the setup, the premise, the story, the cast, it's saved from that, luckily. The film, because of its like mature themes that in here, we have like divorce in the story, we have some scary imagery, some of the language sort of is quite mature in places, but it manages to keep it somewhat in check. But this is the kind of movie that sort of your kids would get. Like, it's a movie that is for kids, and it's not patronising, and that's what when I talk about kids movies, Return to Oz like this, when they're not done in a patronising way, they're not holding the kids' hands all the way through the movie. Like, this film is dark, just like Return to Oz is dark. Legend is another one by Ridley Scott, very, very dark. But it's no worse for being dark. Like I say, this film is not patronising. The film is actually quite punk in its nature, and it does sort of give a middle finger to what a kids' film is meant to be. Howie Mandel's Maurice, you think is going to be annoying at first, but he sort of becomes less annoying as the film goes on, oddly enough. And it's one of their movies that whenever I've seen it on TV, there's always odd bits cut or some scenes edited out, which in many ways is, it's quite understandable. But when it's like sometimes they put things on TV, and it's like, why even bother showing it if you're going to cut the living hell out of it? But when I've seen this on TV and they've repeated it, it's usually some language has been cut out, or especially a few scenes from the ending, sort of usually omitted, little scenes here and there. Even the look of Maurice himself is not exactly the most kid-friendly, and the film does have a lot of toilet humour throughout. And whilst the film, I'd say, I don't think it's a classic. It really is an entity unto itself, and it was a firm favourite of mine when I was little, and it always felt like I was watching something that was sort of naughty. Like I say, there was a lot more mature than other kids' movies that were happening at the time. You know, this wasn't like Never Ending Story or or anything like that. This was a very sort of punk rock horror kids film. And it's one really worth checking out if you've never seen it. So as I say, yeah, the film with my child, and as we all know, Fred Savage was a huge big deal at the time. So we meet the Stevenson family, who have just moved to a new house, and watching it again, why do I always, when I watched it again recently, I mean, I hadn't seen it for a number of years, watching it again, because I just wanted to get a review of it, just my opinions on it on the channel. But I always forget that Daniel Stern was in the movie. I always forget that Daniel Stern is in here. So they've moved here. It's not all working out. The move isn't going too well. And like Brian's parents, Fred Savage's character, they're having a few problems. Eric, his younger brother, thinks that he has a monster under his bed. Brian, in our introduction to him, we learn that he likes peanut butter and onion sandwiches. Yum yum. Brian gets blamed for all these like shenanigans that keep happening around the house, like putting ice cream in the cupboard and like a bike in front of his dad's car. And I love how on the bus he blames his younger brother about the bike. He blames his brother. He's like, why did you put my bike? He said something along the lines of, why did you put my bike in front of dad's car or something like that? And he's like, how can it be me? Like, my feet don't even touch the pedals. Like, how is that? Like, why would I even do that? So look out for a very young Buzz McAllister here as Ronnie, the school bully. Buzz McAllister from Home Alone. It's weird when you think you've got two people from Home Alone in this movie. So to prove there is nothing to worry about regarding the monsters under his brother's bed, Brian agrees to switch rooms with his brother. After trying to prank his brother, Brian returns to the room and finds it a mess with the TV on and the remote sort of sliding under the bed. He agrees to sleep in there again one more night, realising that something is there. And don't you just love it? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid and I watched films like this, don't you just love it in these kids' movies when they set like traps, like anything where there's gadgets and gizmos? Kids were all over it. That's why, like with this, it's like films like the Goonies with the Data character, and like here, anytime there was like like Doc Brown in Back to the Future, when there's gadgets and gizmos and things like that, kids absolutely loved it. I mean, look no further than like Inspector Gadget, like cartoon like that, but just loved it. He sets these like traps. And the film works largely, to be fair, due to Fred Savage's performance, who is great as Brian. I mean, I think he does a fantastic role here. And you just have to love how he uses like Doritos as bait to catch whatever it is under the bed. To be fair, if I had Doritos on the bedroom floor and I woke up to the sound of someone eating them, then I would be a bit freaked out too. Like if it was dead quiet and it was pitch black and I was in bed and there was Doritos on the floor and I suddenly woke up and my door was shut and I could suddenly hear somebody actually eating said Doritos, I would be a bit spooked. And I love how his dad comes in afterwards and sees him like wrestling some clothes after he thinks he sort of catches Maurice. And I mean, his dad doesn't believe him, but couldn't Brian have just said, well, you explain to me, couldn't he have just said, you explain to me who these clothes are then? Like there's these clothes, because Maurice sort of like disappears and his clothes are sort of left there. And because Brian's just left sort of wrestling him. His dad comes in, he's like, what are you doing? And like, couldn't he have just said, well, Dad, you explain to me whose these are then? They're not yours, they're not mine. Whose are these clothes? So he catches Maurice, and I love how at the start Brian is like in his like sadistic way, he's happy to let him like sort of die, like sort of when exposed to sunlight, as he is still angry that his bike got trashed. And Brian in this is quite nasty in some places. Maurice is as well. Like I say, these two, when they start getting together and bonding, they don't necessarily get up to all good stuff. Some of what they do is quite bad, but I'd say Brian is still PO'd that his bike got trashed. And quite funny too that at first he thinks he says, oh, do I get 3 wishes? Like he says to Maurice, like, no, that's not going to happen. As I say, the design of Maurice isn't over, like it's not the most kids friendly idea, but you like makeup in the world, but you do get used to it. But it's a very sort of like I say, I think it's quite for a young kid. I think it would have been a bit of a scary design. I was a bit like sort of freaked at first, but you do get used to it. And like I say, you really do get that over the top in your face, Michael Keaton, Beetlejuice type of performance here. So Maurice takes Brian down to the monster world, basically, right? where there's like sort of loads of food, there's games, there's no rules, there's no regulations, there's no parents. It's basically do whatever you like, go crazy. And there's lots of stairs leading to various kids' bedrooms. And as I say, watching it again recently, the film maybe doesn't hold up as well as I remember, but there's still a lot of fun to be had here. And if you were watching this when about 6 or 7, the idea of, you know, hanging out playing video games with monsters and that whole idea there might be another world under your bed, it really resonated with me. It was something, there was no other film like it. And like I say, when I say this film isn't patronising, it isn't. It actually does pull on your heartstrings a little bit at the end of the movie as well, and it's a bit of a slow build, but you're still it's quite a good film. So like I said, there's some mature elements, like themes going on here in terms of like divorce and sort of friendship and things like that. So we get the 80s music with him and Maurice bonding and doing pranks on other kids in the real world, like putting peanut butter on the phone, cling film over the toilet bowl, you know, all these shenanigans, putting cat food in Ronnie's sandwich, you name it. And our two leads here actually play off each other really well, and it's one of them movies where you can honestly like say, I think this is one of the movies you can look at that and you can just simply say they don't make them like they used to. Like this is one of them movies, like they just simply don't make them like they used to. You have a montage of all these kids they have prank getting like a royal telling off by their parents. And it's quite odd at one point, like that Maurice eats like this girl that Brian likes, Kirsten, her name, at school, and like Maurice at one point he sort of eats her homework, and he's like his hand turns into like this dog thing, and it's really sort of freaky. Like even watching it again now, it's a bit what is going on? And it turns into like this, I don't know, this little sort of, I'll say this dog-like creature. So Eric wakes up one night and wonders where Brian is as he wants a flashlight. So in the monster world, we meet Schnick, who is like protecting the boys' stairway, who is like the leader of the monster world. And worth noting, there is also a decapitation in the movie, which is not something you would come to expect, but there is actually like I say, a decapitation in the movies. As I say, this isn't the most... This is a mature kids film. Make no doubt, make no mistake about that. This is a mature film, a mature kids film in every sense of the word. But yeah, Snick, he rips one of the young girls' heads off at one point. So there you go. And I wish they would have expanded more on like these guys and fleshed out like sort of some of the other monsters there, so like who they were and things like that. So Brian gets into a mood with Maurice about eating Kirsten's homework, and one of my favourite lines in the movie, when Maurice, because Brian is absolutely PO'd that he ate Kirsten's homework at this point, and there's like such a great line that Howie Mandel says as Maurice when he says, "Look, it just so happens that at that moment I had a craving on a 6-page essay on the daytime blooming on a nighttime cactus, and I tell you, it was something I got incredible heartburn from." And he says that, and then at the same point his horns get stuck in the wall as well at one point. And the film does have some great liners here and there scattered throughout. And with some of the language used, though, and the nature of some of the things in the movie, it's almost like it slipped by. It's almost like it slipped by the governing body, or like the people that were sort of rating the movies, or they just simply weren't paying attention, or they had a bit of a day off in that day on that week. Because this film does push the boundaries. It really does in terms of language and things like that and what goes on. So with the drama and the troubles about family life and growing up, his parents announced they're sort of going to have a trial separation. And when I say the film is dark, like the scene where Maurice and him and all the other monsters are going to scare a baby, sort of borders on really cruel. Like it really is cruel and nasty, which Brian doesn't want any part of. Because like I say, you start to warm to Maurice and you start to get... you're not sure, you think he's a bit strange and weird at first, but you start to warm to him, and then it's like, right, we're going to go and scare a baby, and you have all these like horror, like scary, intimidating monster faces and like the makeup and everything over this like young baby, this little child, and it's very unsettling, that scene. But as I say, Brian wants nothing to do with it. Now also, when some lights hit him, like at this point, when some light hits Brian, his arm sort of disappears and he learns sort of he's shrinking as well. I guess you could argue like Brian is using the monster world as a way to sort of escape from the problems of the real world, if you wanted to look at it in a more deeper level. Not that we need to, but that's probably what you could argue sort of is going on here. So Snick wants Brian to become one of them, basically, is what happens. They want Brian to sort of become a monster. They want him to join them. He uses like a sofa bed to come through into the real world, as Brian has sort of sawn off the legs of all the beds at this point, so sort of no monsters can come through. But Snick sort of uses the sofa bed. Eric gets kidnapped. We knew there was going to be. You knew the little brother was going to have some plot relevance at some point. Brian recruits Kirsten and Toby, who is like Eric's best friend, to help him get flashlights and form a rescue party. Never understood, like, they go down to the monster world and start flashing, like, this bit where they go down to the monster world and they start flashing their torches at like all the monsters there, most of which are no threat to them whatsoever. And I never understood that even when I watched it the first time. I was like, why are they sort of shining the flashlights at these monsters for? They've done nothing to them whatsoever. They weren't doing anything wrong. And they meet Boy, basically, who's sort of the guy in charge. Nowhere near as menacing or scary as should have been, but of course was a bit freaky. When you see sort of his real face, when I was a kid. But I guess they had to have sort of an antagonist. To be honest, Snick would have been enough. But yeah, with some of the makeup on Boy and Snick, it is for a kid. It probably would be quite scary. But as I was always sort of I grew to be a huge horror fan. I think this film may have, inadvertently had quite a big part of the reason for that. Why I did get into horror, because this, like I say, this is very much, hence the title, a monster movie. So he just wants Brian, and he's like, his brother Eric is on like a bullseye at this point. So Boy has loads of like miniature tanks and buzzsaws in the floor, and they find themselves in this pit of cuddly toys at one point and use Maurice to push his clothes under the door to sort of let them out. So they go home and get more lights, right? Go home, get more flashlights. And what's weird is they have a rescue attempt. It doesn't succeed. They go back and then they come back in. And they get Ronnie to come along too. They rescue Eric. Maurice like sort of flamethrows Snick, and I love like Toby saying to Ronnie, like he goes like, Coleman, do you think you can take him? Which I thought was quite a funny line. So after the second battle and winning, like they sort of can't go back right at this point, as the sun is like it's up. So like when the sun's up, they can't go back. So they decide to go to a different state in the monster world, sort of where the sun isn't up. So they can go between states in the monster world, sort of where the sun isn't up, so they can find like a get out route. Thing is, if the law is like you stay in the world, you get turned into a monster, right? If you stay in this monster world and you go in there as like a human, you're going to get changed into a monster world. And so if the law is you stay in the monster world, you get turned into a monster, why didn't all the monsters just do that? Like once they were there, find a state where the sun isn't up and just go out that way, use that as your escape route. And you get a real emotional weight scene as Maurice says goodbye to Brian, though I'm not sure why he can't just keep on paying him a visit. I was never explained, like, because they sort of had this big farewell, this big goodbye, but there's no reason at all why he can't still hang out with Maurice after this. Like, it's not like that's it, nothing's gonna, like, it can't come through anymore. They could still theoretically sort of still like see each other. Never explained, but yeah, it still packs a bit of an emotional punch at the end, with Brian saying he's sort of the best friend he ever has. I remember sort of being quite, upset about at the end when they sort of say goodbye. And it ends with Talking Heads, Road to Nowhere playing, and Brian explains to his parents that they are in California. But like I say, no way is Little Monsters perfect, but what a great film from my youth, and believe you and me, a real dark film for younger viewers. And when I say they don't make them like this anymore, say not patronising, it's a kids film done intelligently, very scary, a lot of adult language here and there. Like I say, how this got past some of the the governing body, I have no idea, but dark, very dark for sort of very, very young viewers. But maybe not now, but definitely back in the day, it really did push some boundaries. But to me, it's for the most part, I think Little Monsters, when you say a forgotten gem, I think Little Monsters fits right on into that. But great performance here from Fred Savage, and definitely a cult kids movie, horror movie that's worth checking out. So if you've seen Little Monsters, if it's one of your favourites, be sure to leave a message in the comments below. And I will be trying to review a lot more cult movies I remember that I sort of rented and watched back in the day. So thank you very much indeed for watching. Hope you enjoyed the review. I'll see you again soon.
Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory.